Today I'm going to show you how to build this cabinet with glass doors, done the proper way. Let's get started. Alright, welcome in folks, and as I unload this lumber here that I got from Milwaukee Hardwoods, I like to go through it and just look at the grain and the coloring and see if everything matches. And the two top boards came from the same tree, but the bottom board, which was a 6/4 board that I'm using for the cabinet, is not quite matching. So I went to a lumber yard and picked something up that was close, that's going to be used for things like the top and the doors and the edge banding on the shelves. And that, in conjunction with that 6/4 board, will be all of the hardwood that I need to make up this entire cabinet. So the next step of the process is to mill the lumber, and I don't have a jointer, so I'm going to show you how to do this process, but I have an in-depth video that I'll link to that shows the entire process of milling lumber with just a planer. And the thing about milling is you create a lot of dust, and so you're going to have to empty your dust collector a few times. What I like to do is just go and dump it over the fence in the neighbor's yard and let the wind take care of it for me. All right, I'd love to tell you that I'm a perfect hand tool woodworker, but I am not. I was getting just a slight gap on this glue joint for this top panel. And so I'm gonna show you an alternative way to do it with a router table, to pretty much turn your router table into a jointer. The first step in this process is to install a straight bit into your router table. This is a Craig router table. It has these little spacers that slide in the slots behind the fence. You're going to use those to create an offset in your fence between the front, the infeed, and the outfeed side. The outfeed side gets lined up with a straight edge to the bit, and so you just tap back the infeed side to create a little bit of a space, and that sets up the jointer. Now run it through, put pressure on the outfeed side, and you're going to create a perfectly flat surface. Here I'm going to share my top tips for perfect glue ups for panels. 1, spread the glue nice and evenly. Make sure it's smeared all the way across the board. 2, when you put the boards together, give them just a slight jiggle back and forth as you slide them. That way they don't slip around so much later. 3, light pressure as you go and you put on the cauls. You can use just clamps on the ends like this in between your seams. 4, go ahead and put clamps on the top and on the bottom so that you don't have any buckling. And 5, wipe up any of the squeeze out after. And then enter the 6/4 board that I was referencing earlier. At 6/4, my bit was not quite long enough to be able to go through the whole thing, so I'm going to practice my sign flipping, and I might have a career with Cricket Wireless coming up soon, but I'm going to straight edge and joint with track saw instead. And with one straight edge, I can head over to the table saw to start ripping everything down to size. And you can see here I'm using the thickness of the board to set the fence because I'm making squares. And I like to double check everything on the first time, and then I know that I can rip everything all at once with that same setting and head over to the miter saw to start cutting everything to final size. And I like to do this always with a stop block so that all of my parts are exactly the same size. The actual length doesn't really matter, but what does matter is that all of the legs are the same and all of the stretchers are exactly the same length. That just helps make a nice consistent square box, make everything easier for you and for your joinery. And speaking of joinery, right now, and I did this on all sets, but I am making sure that everything looks good and is consistent, mostly with color, and that is laying out, the sides and making sure everything's going to match nicely between the legs and the stretchers. So after laying out all of my marking lines, I realized that what I wanted to put into the cabinet is not going to fit if I use a real mortise and tenon and cut tenons in these. So for some reason I got my math wrong in my head, and these needed to be about 1.5 inches longer from the front to back stretchers. So a little change of plan. I'm going to go with floating mortise and tenon. So still mortise and tenon, still going to be very strong, but I'm going to do a floating version. And I don't have what other YouTubers do, the Festool domino. So here I am setting up my router with a bushing guide, and this makes it so that I can create a little template routing that way instead. So set the depth on the router, and then you can see here, this is a very simple jig. It's just a fence creating a corner that meets up with a square hole in the middle that I used a Forstner bit to drill and then used a chisel to clean up. And this combination of jig and router makes it so that I can create a somewhat square hole that will later accept a floating tenon. It's always good to think about the order of operations in your woodworking. So right now I am creating a channel for the back panel. And this, the first one was for the stretcher. This is for the leg. So I'm actually doing a stop cut because I didn't want to go all the way through and see it later. So I marked the beginning of my blade where I need to stop with that piece of tape, and then I have a mark on the leg. And now I'm doing a drop cut where I'm dropping the piece down into the blade to start the cut instead of stopping, because it's on the opposite side and I didn't want to have to move the fence and worry about inconsistencies and lining up later. But my point is, this groove is very easy to cut now and would be very hard to cut later. So order of operations matters. Make sure to do stuff when it's easy. And now I can create the tenons. I'm doing that with a roundover bit and checking to see if it's tight enough. It was pretty good, so I'm just going to clean up those ridges with a hand plane and then cut them all down to size. So anytime I use floating tenons in a project, I like to pre-glue them in ahead of time, let them sit for a day. That way they're nice and solid in there and they act just like a normal mortise and tenon. Just make sure to clear any glue squeeze out ahead of time so it doesn't interfere with assembly. And what you're seeing me do is a little dry fit, and it looks a little bit funny because it's just a rail. There's no panel, but this is a side panel of the cabinet. So what I'm going to do is actually clamp it in place, make sure it's nice and tight, and then bring a router to it to create a rabbet that then some plywood is going to sit in. So I'm setting up for a perfect depth so it sits nice and flush on the inside, and then I ran into a bit of a problem here. It was not lined up perfectly, so that's part of the problem with the jig, I guess. My fences might have been off, so I used a hand plane to clean it up so I could finish routing everything and move on to cutting plywood. There's nothing like trying to break down a big, heavy 3/4 inch sheet of plywood in a tiny little shop with my tiny little table. These things weigh, if you've never had to move them, around 80 pounds usually. And this is the moment that I realized that my tools that I needed, the tracks for my trek saw, were stuck in a corner and I wasn't able to get to them. So I had to crawl underneath and retrieve all of what I needed. And then I'm going to show you something that's a little bit weird. I'm going to line up and square up, not to the edge, but to the veneers in the plywood. And I'm going to cut a 90-degree, a perpendicular cut to that veneer to make sure that everything's running really straight and it looks good in the final product. And after that's done with the trek saw, it's time to go over the table saw and do a little bit of ripping, get everything down to perfect width, and then head over with the marking gauge to set the depth of the cut that I need to make on this piece of plywood. Using that marking gauge, I ensure that I have a perfect line here. I don't have any chip out on any of that delicate plywood. And last thing to do on these is, you saw that it was rounded in the middle. And so I need to cut out the corners. I could round them, but you're never going to see this and it doesn't really matter. So it's much easier just to cut off the corners and not worry about it. And then I can do the dry fitting and get everything all hunky-dory on this side panel. And I was actually surprisingly really proud of myself at this point. And so I went inside to go show off to my wife, and she liked the hardwood that she was seeing so much that she said, you know what, it's time to go to bed. And the next day, after I had both side panels put together in a dry fit, I wanted to do a full dry fit just to make sure that I didn't have any issues. And this is key to woodworking. get all of your pieces dry fit, make sure that everything looks good, and you get rid of any issues before you introduce glue. And then take it all apart, sand everything, and then put it back together with glue so it's all permanent. And what I caught in this process is these tenons were just slightly too long, not on the sides, but on the long rails. Because of the depth of cut, they were intersecting each other inside of those mortises. So it was an easy fix. I just cut them down before I ever did any assembly on that part. And as you can see, I just broke the handle of my smoothing plane, so now I got another future project to rebuild one of those, but instead I used a little block plane that I reset as a smoothing plane to use for this case to just level everything off, and then I use a different block plane to take a bit of a bigger cut to chamfer the bottom of the feet. And if you've never done this, it's key for any wooden furniture. If you don't do this, then likely you're going to get chip out if someone tries to drag this thing across the ground. So it's just a nice way to ease that end grain so that it won't catch and won't splinter later. And then it's time to move on to final assembly. But because I did all of the pre-assembly, making sure that the dry fit went well, this went very smoothly. Just glue, stick everything together, put it all into clamps, and let it sit overnight. And at this point, I want to address a worry that you may have if you're new to this or want to get into woodworking. This may look complicated and the end product may look intimidating, but I want to let you know that it really isn't. If you're paying attention, each place along this has been just a process, and every process can be complicated in small pieces, and that's all woodworking really is: breaking things down into small manageable chunks and accomplishing them one at a time. So at this point in the project, I did what you're supposed to do and lift with your legs. I think I'm doing it right. I don't know, everybody always says lift with your legs, not your back. And get this thing up on the bench so that I could do final sanding. And you might be wondering, well, you just did all of that planing. Why would you do the final sanding? Isn't planing good enough? And sometimes it is. But in my case, I wanted consistent finish quality, I'd say. So I wanted to do some sanding to make sure that everything looks nice and even. And then I'm going to move it down off of my bench and have a little steam bowl. Whoopsie poopsie, that's what I get for trying to show off for the camera. And I created a bit of a ding that required some additional sanding just to remove these little drywall marks. And there was a little bit of embedded drywall in there that I took off later, off camera. And now it's time for the back panel. So just like I cut down before, using the track saw and putting this on the bench, and you can see that I used some 2x4s to support the plywood so that it would not bend on me, because this is only 1/4 inch. Pretty fragile. It's actually MDF, so I could break it fairly easily. And you can see that top stretcher I made not as thick, so this would slide in and then secure it with screws. And then just trim the top, because I left a little bit of excess, better to have it long than short, and I can move on to the shelves. So this bottom shelf is going to be permanently installed, so I'm going to create a few little support pieces, and since I'm cutting this to be exactly the right length, I use it as a story stick so I don't have to do any measuring and still make sure that I get a perfect fit. So after ripping it to the correct size, I could cut it on the miter saw. You can see I couldn't do the whole thing in one pass on the slider. So my trick here is to then put the blade down into the kerf so that I get a nice cut on the final little piece that's holding it together. Apply some glue and put everything into place. But what you'll notice when I put this in here, I put glue on the front because as I dry fit it, I realized I had a bit of a gap in the very front. I don't know if there's some bow in that front stretcher, but I just pulled it out with a few clamps, and the glue held that nice and securely in place so that there were no gaps. Remember that top that we created a long time ago, ages ago, and I'm going to create an under bevel on it. And you can see that there, I'm marking it out just to eye kind of what looks good, and then I'm going to take my marking gauge and create 2 lines, because there's multiple ways to do this. You can do it with a router, but I'm going with such a steep underbevel that the router wouldn't work without a special bit. I've seen people do this with a table saw standing up on end, but I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way with a hand plane. When it comes to hand planing, it's really a pretty simple process. You're just trying to connect the 2 lines that I made. And I'm bringing it down with 1 hand plane to get pretty darn close, and then I'm going to use my number 5 jack plane here to smooth it out, because I'm taking less of a cut. The other one I had set up more of a scrub plane. And lastly, just do a little bit of sanding on the edge. I'd actually ripped this afterward because I blew out the grain at the end, which is what you're gonna do, which is why you want to plane and then rip and then sand and then it's done. And now to move on to the doors. Now that pretty much the whole cabinet's done, I'm taking the rest of this lumber that I had laying back there, and oh, did you catch that? Here, I'm going to zoom in for you. Watch this. You see that board move all funny at the end? Well, it actually broke because there's so much tension in this piece of walnut that it was pinching at the very end, creating pressure that broke the board apart as I got to the end. So I needed to do a little jointing in between, and I made sure one side was nice and flat, and then I'm going to run the other side through all together, bound at the ends with the clamps, and then taped together in the middle, right through the planer to make sure everything is perfectly square and level, just so that they're all the same size, because I didn't want to have to go back to the table saw after I had them all ripped. The last thing is these doors are glass, like I had mentioned earlier, and I needed to create a groove in the middle. So what I'm going to do is a normal shaker style cabinet door, where I create a groove. The easiest way to do this is to do a rip close to the middle, flip it around, rip it again, and now you have a centered groove, and then you move your table saw incrementally the fence further away to continue to widen that until you get the right spacing. And the rest of this is pretty self-explanatory if you've ever made a cabinet door like this. You know, cut all of the pieces, trying to make everything to fit, so try to do as little measuring as possible. And then the last thing that I'm going to do here is just show you how I do this by hand. I don't always do it by hand, but this is just a good learning opportunity for me to practice with my hand tools to cut all of these little tenons. But I do think that's a key thing to do on projects, is to test yourself when you know that you can. You have the luxury of doing that. In this case, I'm building this cabinet for my wife, and it's not going to a client. I don't really have a huge time constraint, and if I mess up a little bit and these are a little bit off, then I can deal with it. But the whole point is that I am learning some new skills, I'm growing, and I'm testing myself, and that's what a project like this is for, is to get better now, so that when I do this for a client, then it'll come out perfect because I've done it and I've practiced. And I mentioned at the beginning that I'm making these cabinet doors with glass, and I'm doing it the right way. And this is what I mean. I made the cabinet door the normal way, but normally what you would do is you would put a panel inside as you glued it together. I'm gluing this together first, and then routing out the back side so that the glass can sit in there. And then I, of course, need to square off all of the corners because a router can't get into the corner. Hence a little chisel work. And as you can see, I sat on the frame itself to hold it in place. Use your body where you can when using hand tools, and the best clamp that you have is often your butt. And before I actually put the glass in, I'm going to get everything prepared, which means drilling out for the hardware. I'm using some Blum soft close on these because, again, it's glass and I did not want any slamming of these doors. I have a couple of little kids, and the last thing I needed was glass all over the place because someone got a little overzealous in their use of the doors. And finally, the moment of truth. The glass comes in, and will it fit? And it does, like a glove. How nice. Now, how am I going to hold the glass in place? Well, with glass stays is what they're called. Just a couple of thin pieces of wood that I karate chop in half, and you'll notice that there's a bow to these. So I used to work for a contractor who installs glass, and what he taught me on glass stays is it's okay to have them really tight because they're so small that you're going to hold them in place with nails anyway, and it's better to have that extra bow than to have them a little bit too loose and have the glass rattle around. So that's what I'm going with. Next thing is get the doors installed without the glass, because with the glass it makes the doors pretty darn heavy, and I'd rather do just the wooden frame. Make sure that everything fits, and I put a stop in because again these are soft close, so you need something to butt up against. So I just use a little scrap piece of walnut, glued in there, flush trimmed off. And now we're ready to cue up the quick shelf making montage. I need to attach the top somehow. So what I'm going to do is route out these little slots in the top, and then I'm going to cut, using some offcuts from the doors, some buttons. And these are like Z clips, if you've seen those. I just didn't want to have to look at them, so instead I'm using walnut offcuts to create these little pieces here with a countersunk hole that then slide into the slots perfectly, and I can run some screws through into the top later that will secure it into place. And on to finish. Everything in this project gets pre-finished before assembly because it's easier to apply a hard wax oil, that's what I'm using, in a laying down fashion. And you can see here the cabinet I'm not going to lay down, but something I didn't show earlier was this nice little bullet that I found in the planing process that I'm leaving. It's going to go on the inside corner against the wall, so you're never going to see it, except for everybody watching this video will know that it's there. And I guess my wife will, because I showed it to her, so everybody that's probably ever going to see the cabinet is going to know that it's there, so that's kind of fun. But the last thing is the stays. I needed to drill some holes for some nails, and I'm using a pin nails from my pin nailer, but I'm going to drive them in by hand so I can ensure consistency, and I pre-drilled all of these because last thing I wanted was to break one at the very last moment. So just a little drive in with the hammer and set it. But I did realize as I was going that I made a mistake. I put one hole right where my hinges landed, which meant that I drove a nail right through. Not too big a deal, you know, we're woodworkers, we overcome difficulties. All I did was I just punched the nail in a little bit further than I normally would have, and that gave me some space to snip off the end and then push it back so it sat flush at the surface. That way the hinge still cleared and fit in there nicely. And at this point in the project, the final details are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to leave you to watching those while I ask you a question. You made it this far in the video, so you must have liked something. Leave me a comment down below and let me know what you liked, and if you didn't like something, let me know. I'd like to correct it in the future. And if you down there, feel free to subscribe so you can see my future content, see how I improve, and I really just want to say thank you so much for watching. It means a lot to me, and with that, I'll let you get to the final reveal.